I thought I was sitting down to a family dinner, but I was actually attending the quiet execution of my future. My father didn't even have the decency to look ashamed when he told me my life's anchor had been traded for a stranger's check. They sold the one thing that kept me whole, handing over the keys to my grandmother's legacy to fund a weekend of luxury for a brother who never worked for a thing. My mother spoke about the wedding decor with such terrifying normalcy that I felt the oxygen leave the room, replaced by the suffocating weight of their betrayal. Every photo of the venue they showed me was a paper cut, a visual reminder that in this family, my worth was nothing more than collateral. I sat there, a ghost at the table, watching them celebrate a heist. They expected me to applaud. But as I looked at the documents they were so proud of, a cold, sharp clarity began to cut through the heartbreak. They think they've won because they have the money, but they've overlooked the one detail that turns a sale into a crime. They're so busy planning the perfect I do that they haven't realized I've already planned the perfect I won't. The silverware clinked against the porcelain like a countdown, and as I looked up at my father's calm face, I realized the dinner was over, but the reckoning was just. The silverware clinked against the porcelain with a rhythmic, clinical precision that usually made me feel at home, but tonight, the sound felt like a countdown. We were sitting in the dining room of my parents' estate, a place built on old money and even older expectations, celebrating Julian's upcoming nuptials. My brother sat across from me, glowing with the unearned confidence of a man who had never been told no, while his fiancée, Chloe, picked at her salad with a predatory sort of grace. I had come tonight specifically to discuss the transition of the lake house. The property my grandmother, Nana Jo, had left specifically to me in her will. It was more than real estate, it was my sanctuary, the only place I felt I belonged after years of being the reliable daughter who worked 80-hour weeks while Julian found himself on our parents' dime. I waited for a lull in the conversation about silk thread counts and destination brunches to bring it up, but before I could speak, my father cleared his throat, his expression devoid of the usual guilt he wore when Julian asked for a favor. "We already sold it," my dad said, his voice as flat as if he were discussing the weather or a change in the dinner menu. I felt the air leave my lungs in a single, violent rush, my fingers locking around the stem of my water glass so hard I thought the crystal might shatter. I looked at him, then at my mother, waiting for the punchline that I knew wasn't coming. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until my mother added, "It was for Julian's wedding. Elena. You have to understand, the costs for the Amalfi Coast venue were astronomical, and the flowers alone required a down payment we hadn't factored in." She said it with a terrifying level of normalcy, as if selling a house that belonged to me was just another line item in a family budget I no longer had a say in. Beside her, Chloe didn't look surprised, she didn't even look sympathetic. She just leaned back and adjusted her engagement ring, a small, knowing smirk playing on her lips as she caught my eye. It was the look of someone who had watched the heist happen from the front row and was now enjoying the fallout. My father reached down beside his chair and pulled out a thick, leather-bound portfolio, sliding it across the mahogany table toward me. "We kept you in the loop, in spirit," he said, and I realized he was actually serious. I opened the folder to find high-resolution photos of the wedding preparations, decor, mock-ups, the sprawling Italian villa, Julian and Chloe laughing during a site visit, and a series of receipts that made my head swim. They were showing me the evidence of how they had spent my inheritance. Every photo was a slap, a visual representation of my future being traded for a weekend of champagne and ego. I Looked at the images of the grand ballroom and the custom-built stage, knowing that the floorboards of my grandmother's house had paid for every inch of it. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the wine. I just sat there, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, feeling like a ghost at my own execution. Julian leaned forward, his voice dripping with a forced, pathetic sincerity. Elena, you're so successful already. You don't need the house like I need this wedding. This is about the family name. You'll get the next one, right? He laughed, a short, hollow sound, and for a second, my father hesitated, his hand hovering over a second set of documents in the folder, his eyes darting to Julian's face, as if checking for permission to keep speaking. In the corner of the room, my cousin Marcus, who worked as my father's assistant, but was really just a glorified errand boy, was leaning against the sideboard. I noticed he wasn't eating. Instead, he was holding his phone at a slight angle, his thumb hovering near the edge of the screen. He wasn't texting. He was recording. The realization should have made me angry, but it only added to the cold clarity settling over me. The entire room was a trap, a staged intervention designed to make me accept the theft of my life's anchor as a necessary sacrifice for the golden child. The cruelty wasn't just in the act of selling the house, it was in the expectation that I would smile and ask for a bridesmaid dress. The door to the kitchen swung open, and the lead caterer stepped in, opening his mouth to announce the next course, but he stopped dead when he felt the temperature in the room. He looked at my father's rigid posture and my mother's forced smile, then turned around and retreated without a word. The heavy oak door swinging shut with a soft thud that felt like a gavel. I looked down at the last page in the folder, a summary of the closing costs and the final sale price of the lake house. My eyes snagged on a notification that popped up on my father's phone, which was lying face up on the table. It was a message from the real estate agent who had handled the sale. The preview text read, Gerald, we need to talk about the discrepancy in the title transfer. The buyer is flagged because the signature on the secondary deed doesn't match the screen went dark before the rest of the sentence could load. My father swiped the phone away, his movements hurried, but the damage was done. I knew that signature. I knew exactly whose hand had signed those papers, and more importantly, I knew whose hadn't. My parents hadn't just overstepped, they had committed a desperation move that was built on a foundation of sand. They thought I'd accept it because I always had. They thought my silence was an agreement. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back with a controlled scrape that silenced Julian's rambling about the guest list. My mother reached out as if to pat my hand, but I stepped back, out of her reach. I hope the wedding is everything you've dreamed of, I said, my voice sounding distant, even to my own ears. Because it's certainly more expensive than you realize. My father narrowed his eyes, sensing a shift he couldn't quite name. Elena, don't be dramatic. It's done. The house is gone. Let's just have a nice dinner. I didn't answer him. I walked out of the room, through the foyer, and out into the cool night air, the sound of their laughter starting up again before I had even reached my car. They were already celebrating their victory. They were already spending the rest of the money in their heads. I sat in the driver's seat and pulled a small, worn envelope from my glove box, the original deed Nana Jo had given me privately, a year before she died, with a specific notary stamp dated 3 months after the one my father had just used to sell the property. The timing was off. The legal chain was broken. They thought the celebration was just beginning, but as I Dialed my lawyer's private line. I knew the real party wouldn't start until the morning after the wedding. They had sold a house they didn't own, and the person who actually held the keys was no longer playing the role of the quiet daughter. The morning after that dinner, my lawyer, Sarah Vance, didn't greet me with the usual pleasantries. She sat behind her glass desk with a series of land title documents spread out like a roadmap to a crime scene. I had sent her the scans of the deed Nana Joe gave me, and the contrast between my document and the one my father filed was blinding. Sarah leaned forward, her pen hovering over a specific clause in the transfer papers my father had submitted to the county. "Elena, we really need to," she started, then stopped mid-sentence, her eyes tracing a line of text she seemed unable to process. She looked up at me, the color drained from her face, and for a moment, the professional facade she'd maintained for a decade wavered. She didn't finish the thought, instead she just pushed a photocopy toward me, her hand trembling slightly. It was a power of attorney form, allegedly signed by Nana Joe 6 months before she passed. The problem was, Nana Joe was in a medically induced coma during the week that document was supposedly notarized. I spent the next 3 days in a state of cold, clinical detachment, watching the digital ghost of my brother's wedding play out on social media. I was a spectator to the destruction of my own life's work. Julian posted photos of the wedding of the century preparations, the hand-carved ice sculptures, the private jets, the imported marble dance floor. Every shimmering detail was a trophy of a theft. My mother sent a single text on Thursday. "Please don't ruin this for him, Elena. We will figure out the money later." There was no later. For a house that had been in our family for 3 generations, a house that was now being used as collateral for a lifestyle Julian couldn't afford. Sarah's investigators discovered that the sale wasn't to a stranger. The buyer was a holding company linked to a man named Victor Rossi, a high-stakes real estate developer Julian had been seen with in several filtered photos. This wasn't just a sale to fund a wedding, it was a debt settlement. My parents hadn't just sold my inheritance, they had handed it over to a shark to keep Julian out of a courtroom. On Friday, the day before the ceremony, I met my father at his office. He tried to act as if nothing was wrong, gesturing for me to sit while he looked at a set of blueprints. When I laid the copy of the comodated power of attorney on his desk, his hands shot out, his fingers clawing at the paper as he tried to grab it from under my palm. I didn't let go. We stood there, locked in a physical struggle over a piece of evidence that proved he was willing to commit a felony for his son. "It was a mistake in the paperwork, Elena," he hissed, his voice tight with a desperation I had never heard before. The notary was a friend. He just got the dates confused. I looked at his manicured hands, the hands that had supposedly held mine when I was a child, and realized he wasn't just lying to me. He was lying to himself. He finally let go of the paper, sinking back into his chair as if the weight of the lie had finally snapped his spine. "Julian was in trouble," he whispered, "there is more to this than you know, Elena. Things that could destroy the family name forever." The wedding day arrived with the kind of polished, expensive perfection that only millions of dollars can buy. I didn't go. I sat in Sarah's office instead, watching the clock. We had already filed the injunction, but we were waiting for the signature verification report. Marcus, my cousin, kept sending me clips from the reception, Julian giving a speech about family values, my mother crying as she toasted to new beginnings. The irony was a physical weight in the room. Then, Marcus sent a video of Julian and Victor Rossi standing in a corner of the villa. Julian looked panicked, his hands moving erratically, while Rossi remained as still as a statue. Marcus's voice came through a muffled audio note. A minute later, Julian is trying to leave for the honeymoon early. He's heading for the airport now, but he looks like he's running from something. My father appeared in the background of the video, his hand on Julian's shoulder, trying to steer him back toward the guests, his face a mask of terror. He was the one holding the crumbling wall together, and he was running out of bricks. By the time the sun rose on Sunday morning, the wedding was a memory of silk and empty bottles. I was standing in my parents' living room when they returned from the airport, having seen Julian and Chloe off. They looked exhausted, the adrenaline of the event having evaporated into the reality of what they had done. My mother stopped at the threshold, her keys jingling in her hand as she saw me standing there with Sarah Vance. She turned as if to flee back to the car, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, but she stopped with her hand on the brass knob, her shoulders shaking. She couldn't leave. There was nowhere to go. My father walked in behind her, his tie loosened, looking every bit the 62-year-old man who had just realized he'd gambled his daughter's life on a losing hand. "The wedding is over, Elena," he said, his voice a ghost of its former authority. "It's done. We can talk about the house now." Sarah stepped forward and placed a leather briefcase on their coffee table. "We aren't here to talk about the house, Gerald," she said, her voice like a scalpel. "We're here to talk about the signature." She pulled out a tablet and tapped a file that was still encrypted with a digital seal. "There's a second set of documents in the county registrar's office that you haven't seen yet, and we haven't even opened the metadata on the digital files from the notary's computer." My father's eyes darted to the tablet, then to me. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the wind to pick up. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. My mother finally turned around, her face a ruin of mascara and grief. "We just wanted everyone to be happy," she whispered, a pathetic defense for a grand-scale betrayal. I looked at her, and then at my father, seeing them clearly for the first time. They weren't just biased, they were accomplices. "I'm not the one who's going to be unhappy," I said, my voice steady and cold. I reached into Sarah's briefcase and pulled out the final piece of evidence we had received an hour ago. The signature on the secondary deed, the one that finalized the transfer to Rossi's company, wasn't a forgery. It was an exact, pixel-perfect digital copy of my own signature. I knew exactly where it had come from. 3 years ago, Julian had asked me to sign a medical consent form for him when he had a minor surgery, claiming he was too groggy to do it himself. I had trusted my brother. I had signed a blank digital pad. He hadn't just stolen my house, he had stolen my identity to sell it. The realization hit my father like a physical blow, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no sound came out. He looked at the document, then at the tablet, and finally at the door. The trap wasn't just set, it was already closing, and the person who had pulled the trigger wasn't even in the country yet. The silence in my parents' living room was no longer the heavy, expectant quiet of a family secret, it was the vacuum left behind after a detonation. My father reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over Julian's contact name, but he didn't press call. He looked at the digital signature on the tablet, the one Julian had harvested from a hospital consent form, and then at the documents proving Nana Jo was unconscious when he claimed she signed over her rights. He started to say, "We can settle this internally, we can," but he stopped when I didn't even blink. I chose not to look at him, keeping my eyes fixed on a small, chipped baseboard in the corner of the room. My refusal to engage with his panic was the first real boundary I had set in 32 years. Sarah Vance didn't wait for him to recover. She reached out and closed the laptop with a sharp final click, signaling that the time for negotiation had ended before it even began. The consequences moved with a terrifying, administrative speed. Because the sale to Victor Rossi's holding company involved a fraudulent title transfer and identity theft, the secondary deed was flagged by the county's fraud unit. Within hours of our filing, my father tried to call the notary, a man named Miller who had been a family friend for decades, likely hoping to convince him to fall on his sword. He failed. Miller had already been contacted by the state board. He had seen the evidence of Nana Joe's medical records and had immediately retained his own counsel, refusing to take my father's calls. My mother sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, her hands pleating the fabric of her skirt over and over. She looked at me, her mouth opening to offer an apology or a plea, but she saw the way I was standing next to Sarah, not as a daughter, but as a plaintiff. She closed her mouth and looked at the floor, finally understanding that the piece she had bought by enabling Julian had just become the most expensive mistake of her life. By Monday afternoon, the wedding of the century was being dismantled by the same people who had built it. Victor Rossi wasn't a man who enjoyed being a lead character in a fraud case. When Sarah presented the verified deed and the evidence of the stolen signature, Rossi's legal team didn't fight. They didn't want the lake house anymore, they wanted their money back, and they wanted it with interest. They immediately filed a prejudgment attachment on my father's manufacturing plant and my parents' primary estate. I watched from a distance as the Italian villa's vendors began sending frantic invoices to Julian, who was currently sitting in a holding area at the airport in Rome. His accounts had been frozen the moment the criminal referral for identity theft hit the system. There was a brief moment of resistance when the bank tried to argue that the digital signature carried a presumption of validity, but Sarah countered with the timestamp from the hospital's patient portal. The bank's representative reviewed the logs for less than a minute before stepping back and notifying their compliance department. The game was over. I didn't answer the 17 calls I received from my mother that evening. I didn't read the emails from Julian, which I'm sure were filled with the same brand of charming manipulation he'd used his entire life. Instead, I drove to the lake house. The sold sign was still on the lawn, but the locks had already been changed by a court-appointed receiver. I stood on the porch where Nana Joe used to sit, watching the way the moonlight hit the water, feeling the weight of the property returned to my name. It wasn't just about the dirt or the wood, it was about the fact that they couldn't erase me. My father's manufacturing plant went into an emergency audit the following morning. The investigation into the lake house sale had pulled a loose thread, revealing that the money Julian used for his lifestyle hadn't just come from my inheritance, it had been siphoned from the company's pension fund. My father wasn't just a bad parent, he was a failing businessman who had used his son's wedding as a smokescreen for his own insolvency. The final meeting took place at the district attorney's office. Julian had been extradited back, looking hollowed out and stripped of the Italian silk he'd been wearing 48 hours prior. He sat between our parents, all three of them, looking at me as if I were the one who had betrayed them. My father tried to lean across the table, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "Elena, if you testify to the signature being a misunderstanding, We can save the plant. We can keep Julian out of a cell. Think about the family. I looked at him, then at Julian, who couldn't even meet my eyes. He was looking at his hands, probably wondering how the person he'd spent a lifetime ignoring had been the one to finally stop him. I didn't give a speech. I didn't tell them how much it hurt. I simply pushed my sworn statement across the table to the prosecutor and stood up. I didn't look back as I walked out, even when I heard my mother's voice break into a jagged, ruined sob behind me. 2 weeks later, the lake house was quiet. The investigators were gone, the liens were settled, and the sold sign had been tossed into the wood chipper. I sat in the kitchen, the same kitchen where Julian had once told me I'd get the next one, and looked at the original deed Nana Joe had left for me. The house was mine, the manufacturing plant was in receivership, and my father was facing a series of charges that no amount of social standing could fix. Julian was gone, living in the reality of a world where his sister's name wasn't a blank check. I picked up my phone and saw a final message from Marcus, who had been fired the day the audit started. He had sent a photo of the family estate, the big house where we grew up. There was a foreclosure notice pinned to the front door. The architecture of their deception had finally collapsed, and unlike them, I wasn't going to spend a single second trying to rebuild it for them. I walked out to the dock and felt the cold air settle into my lungs, clean and sharp. The absence I had felt for 5 years, that phantom limb of a family that never really saw me, was finally gone. I realized then that I hadn't lost anything at that dinner 3 weeks ago. I had simply stopped paying for a seat at a table that was never mine to begin with. I looked out at the dark water, the silence of the lake finally matching the silence in my head. They had spent 30 years making sure I was invisible, and in the end, that was exactly what allowed me to take everything they had. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a message from Sarah Vance confirming the final title record was clear. I didn't reply. I just watched the horizon until the sun began to rise, illuminating a world where I was finally the only one holding the pen. The locks were new, the name on the gate was mine, and for the first time in my life, the house was actually full.